Ah, the Victorians, an age of elegance, refinement, and unbelievable filth. Here in the 21st century, we look back at the time with rose-tinted glasses, an era of corsets and top hats, horse-drawn carriages, and steam-powered automata. If there's one thing that can ruin the illusion of the good old days more than another, it's learning about how the other half lived. And if we look at the poorest of the poor, life during the Victorian era was objectively terrible. Today, we're going to be looking at what life was like in a typical Victorian workhouse. These institutions were designed for those who found themselves without a home or without enough money to support themselves. But they were also places of incredible misery and hardship, where death was often just a fact of life. You'll find some aspects of this video quite disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. For our purposes today, let's define a workhouse as an institution established by the British Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. The goal of these institutions was to provide a place for those who needed help from the local parish, while imposing work requirements in order to qualify for support. In practice, this meant the workhouses became prisons for the destitute, holding them against their will. It's important to note that not all destitute people ended up in workhouses. Those who had family or friends who could care for them would likely have been sent to live with them instead, even if that meant living in extreme poverty. There are accounts of families being utterly destitute, with all but one member of the family ending up in a workhouse, while the remaining person stays at home to prevent the same fate for their pet. Animals weren't considered property at the time, and so could be taken into a workhouse and put down without a second thought. The first thing any new arrival would have noticed about a workhouse is the smell. It didn't matter whether you arrived voluntarily or were sent there under compulsion, your clothes would soon reek of stale waste and disease. Many of the buildings which housed the workhouses had once been prisons, and some still operated as both a prison and a workhouse simultaneously. It was common for them to be located away from the main population centers, cut off from society, and often difficult to access even for visitors. If you were able to visit someone inside a workhouse, you'd only be allowed to see them in a common area, likely while they were working. The idea was that work was the best medicine for destitution, and that keeping busy was the best way to keep minds off their troubles. Depending on their perceived ability, the residents of the workhouse might be given tasks such as sewing, making shoes, weaving, picking oakum, which involved separating ropes into their component fibers, or cleaning. If you were lucky enough to get your own room, it wouldn't be much better than the common areas. These rooms were usually cold, damp, and dark, with the only light coming through a small barred window high up on the wall. This window was designed to let in light but not allow for escape. As far as heating went, you'd likely be given a small stove, but these often broke down and left the inhabitants at the mercy of the elements. One survivor of the Great Depression who spent time in a workhouse recalled his time in one of these rooms, saying, "At night, when the wind blew cold air through the cracks in the window frames, I have crouched by my little stove, trying to warm my hands and feet." Food in the workhouse would almost certainly be bland. Watery gruel made from whatever cheap ingredients were available, often just whatever was given to them by those who donated food rather than specifically for the workhouse. A typical breakfast might be a bowl of porridge, while dinner might be boiled beef, mutton, or other meat. Along with root vegetables, for those unable to eat meat, there would be a vegetable stew. If you couldn't finish all of your allotted food, you weren't allowed to take it out of the hall, but you could trade it with other people for something they had been given that you wanted. Many workhouses had a master and matron who ran the facility, along with overseers who watched over the work done by the residents. The master and matron were expected to keep order within the workhouse and ensure the residents were behaving appropriately and doing their work properly. They were also responsible for ensuring that the residents received their rations and generally maintaining the building itself. The overseers were essentially like foremen and supervisors, making sure everything ran smoothly and the residents were kept busy. Residents of workhouses were separated by gender, age, and perceived ability, with men, women, and children working separately and not being allowed to interact. Those considered able-bodied were expected to do the most work, and those who didn't meet expectations could be punished with extra work, with a fine which would take away their meager rations, or solitary confinement. Solitary confinement in a workhouse wasn't the same as solitary confinement in prison. Prisoners might be thrown into solitary for weeks or months at a time, while workhouse inmates might spend a day or two in solitary, if that. Sadly, abuse was fairly common within workhouses. While it's true that many of the people working there genuinely wanted to help those who came through the doors, the sheer number of people requiring assistance combined with the lack of funding and resources led to a situation where mistreatment was par for the course. Beatings and other forms of physical punishment were common, and there were even reports of some masters having relationships with the women in their charge. As you might imagine, such poor treatment led to outbreaks of disease. Smallpox and typhus were common, and tuberculosis claimed many victims, especially among the young. There were attempts to prevent the spread of infection by quarantining the sick in a dedicated fever shed. But it was difficult to enforce this, and often the sick were simply left to die. Those who weren't quarantined were expected to carry on with their daily routines, even if they were coughing up blood. Despite the name, death was common in the workhouses. Any child under 10 years old who died was recorded simply as having died from natural causes. No matter what the actual reason, children over the age of 10, as well as adults, had their cause of death recorded if they died, whether they died from an accident, suicide, murder, or, and most commonly, natural causes. The Victorians believed that starvation was a kind of natural cause, and many residents died as a result of being denied enough food. What makes the story of the workhouses even sadder is that they didn't have to be this bad. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 intended to create a system of national insurance, requiring each parish to raise money from local taxes to support their own poor. This was intended to stop the situation where the poor would end up relying on private charity, which was often inconsistent and unreliable. However, in practice, this meant that each parish was only required to support their own poor, leading to situations where the workhouses of one area were full, but those in neighboring areas were empty, because they hadn't yet run out of funds. Parishes were free to administer their funds however they saw fit, and so some created better workhouses than others. The amount of money a parish had available determined the standard of living for the workhouse residents. Some workhouses had access to more resources, meaning they could house residents more comfortably and provide them with better food. Other workhouses might not have enough money to properly staff the building, leading to the residents being left to their own devices. So it really depended on where you ended up. But if you were unlucky enough to land in one of the worst workhouses, what chances did you actually have of getting out? Well, if you were young, you had some options. Children under the age of 8 could be apprenticed out to tradespeople until they were older. Once they reached the age of 10, boys could volunteer for the Navy or Army, leaving the workhouse behind for a life at sea or abroad. Girls of the same age were often offered the chance to become servants. Those considered able-bodied, the stigma attached to receiving this kind of help was very strong, and many refused to accept it unless they absolutely had to. Others applied for admission to a different kind of workhouse, known as a casual ward. These workhouses only accepted short-term residents and provided just enough food and shelter to make their stay brief. Those who chose to stay beyond a few days would find themselves locked inside with the other long-term residents. The toughest of all was staying in the workhouse until you were too old or frail to work. You might be able to leave the workhouse earlier if you had family who could support you, but even then, it could be difficult to convince them to take you back. There are stories of families choosing to disallow their relatives to leave a workhouse, perhaps because of the stigma associated with it, perhaps because it was cheaper to keep them there. One woman who spent time in a workhouse recalled her experience of being reunited with her mother after several years apart. She said, "I went up to her, threw my arms around her neck, and cried, 'Oh, Mother, I am so glad I have seen you again.' She pushed me away and said, 'Don't you be glad, you nasty beggar, for I have had to pay for D to get you admitted here.' Thanks for watching. Let us know in the comments below if you think the Victorian workhouses were a necessary evil or simply cruel and unusual punishment. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button below. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload.